Okay. Thank you for joining. I know there's a little dead space on the Twitter space side, but we are now live on Twitch as well as Twitter. So, welcome back, PM Peeps, to PM Corner, where we talk about project management subjects, concepts, and apply them to past projects and programs. Now, as you see on the screen, if you're on Twitch, you can see what the name of the subject is tonight. For those of you that are joining on Twitter Space, we are talking about the Apollo Space Program. And this is a really cool and interesting program. It's one of three. It's got a lot of information. So of course, we'll get into that in just a moment. But of course, if you like the content that's being shared on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, please follow me there and subscribe for more content. And as I said, on Twitter, TikTok, Twitch, YouTube, and even Patreon. If you're interested in supporting through donations as well, my PayPal link is available on my link tree, as well as you can subscribe to Patreon, where you get all kinds of cool additional bonuses and features that you may not have had before. Now, I know I just introduced that we were talking about the Apollo space program today, but we're got a couple PMP moments we need to discuss before we start getting into it as a whole. The first subject, or the first PMP moment that I want to talk about, is what is a program versus what is a project? Now, of course, before I begin, if you got any questions, please save them. And of course, I'll stop in between and ask and see if anyone has any. Other than that, just kind of hold on to them because I'm not going to really see right away as I'm not fully paying attention. So, for this PMP moment, we want to understand the difference between a program and a project. Well, per the PMBOK, a project is an effort that is done temporarily. So it has a definitive beginning and end, and it creates a unique product, service, and or result. So very specific, very definable, as I would say. It's kind of similar to a work package in the work breakdown structure, where it's a very specific, definable item. A program, on the other hand, is a little bit different. So while you can have projects, you can also have programs. Now, programs tend to be not as definable. And why do I say that is because programs encompass multiple projects. So if you look in the PMBOK or you see in even the Rita's PMP prep book where she makes it really easy to see, you would see that portfolio first is above. Underneath is programs that fill in a portfolio. So think of stocks, right? You have a stock portfolio. So a program could be restaurant or retail industry. And then your individual projects are like your different, stocks that you invest in restaurant or retail, right? Like your McDonald's, your Starbucks, your whatever. So a program is composed of multiple projects that fulfill a mission. And I'm putting this as plain definition because understanding the difference kind of gets hard because, as I said, a program's not very definable in the regards of even length of time and specific in terms of scope because it can vary from with what the projects are being done within the program. And so that is the difference between a program and a project. And I'm going to stop for a moment to see if there are any questions, but I'm just going to keep going. Okay, so then our next PMP moment is business value. So you probably have heard me numerous times go blue in the face talking about business value. The point why I keep continuously bringing up business value is that you as a PM, whether it's a program or a project, need to understand what is the value of the program or project that you're doing. If you have no understanding of that, you don't have a project or a program. Sorry to break it to you. And that's why in the PMBOK, and also kind of more clearly described in Rita's PMP, exam prep, business value is important and vital to understand because it is what feeds your business case and benefits management plan that then leads to the project charter, which is saying, why are we doing this in the first place? And so to understand business value, you have to do a lot of research. Now, in terms of the Apollo program, yeah, there is a lot of business value. I mean, we're talking space exploration, um, improvements in technology, the ability to explore and see what's out there. I mean, there's still a lot. We haven't seen a whole lot still, in my honest opinion. I know sometimes we think we have, but it's just so vast and there's so much out there. And so one of the big things with the Apollo program, as we'll get into, was all about the race to the moon. So, we know that famous one, which we'll kind of get into a little bit, but not specifically in this stream. May potentially be a future stream. So with that said, let's first introduce the Apollo space program. So it is also known as Project Apollo. So if you were to go Google this right now, you can put either one. You could put Project Apollo or the Apollo space program. Either way, you're going to find it. And of course, this program is the third United States human spaceflight program carried out by NASA. So there were a couple other ones. I remember seeing mention of Artemis, and the first one I did not quite see, so I'll have to research into that. But of course, this program succeeded in preparing and landing the first humans to the moon from 1968 to 1972. So it was a really short span of time. So you can almost say this was a project, but this program was made up of multiple efforts. So this wasn't just a one and done deal. Okay. Unlike what some people think, it was a lot more than that. And of course, the other thing is Apollo, the project conducted by the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration that landed the first humans on the moon. All told, 24 Apollo astronauts visited the moon, and 12 of them walked on its surface. Additionally, NASA's astronauts are scheduled to return to the moon by 2025 as part of the Artemis space program, which I just mentioned that. So I found that interesting little tidbit there, and I just got really excited because, I mean, we know with like Elon Musk, for example, I mean, he's definitely bringing back the space program with SpaceX, right? So, this interest in going back is really important. And I think it is very important. I mean, when we start talking about the birth and when we talk about the implementation, and of course, when we talk about the other, the projects within the Apollo space program and future streams, it's very important to understand that this was a huge to do. It was a huge to do in engineering, in technology, just all around very important. And so we need to not only appreciate what has been done in the past, but we need to take that and move forward and continue that effort. So it was really exciting to read that part, although I don't know if it's completely true. Britannica Encyclopedia kind of quoted that. So obviously we just need to do a little more research. So, of course, let's start with the birth of the Apollo space program. So, it was conceived in 1960 during President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration as a follow up program to Project Mercury. The Mercury capsule was part of this, and so it could hold only one astronaut, and the plan for Apollo was to hold three. Potential missions including ferrying crews to a space station, circumlunar flights, and eventual lunar landings. That was kind of the mission. So that's the business value of the Apollo program, is ferrying crews to space stations, circumlunar flights, and eventual lunar landings. So it was really important. But what's really cool is that the program was named after Apollo, the Greek god of the sun. Of course, he was known for other stuff, but we all know he's for the sun. And it was by Silverstein who chose that name at home one evening in early 1960 because he felt Apollo riding his chariot across the sun was appropriate to the grand scale of the proposed program. Which actually is really fascinating to think about, that you would think of things like that and not even realize it, right? And then to think about that association, I mean, it is quite a grand scale, let's just be honest. I mean, it's just an amazing thought process. So, of course, in July 1960, NASA Deputy Adam Hugh L. Dryden announced the Apollo program to industry reps at a series of Space Task Group conferences. They did provide preliminary specs were laid out with a mission module cabin, separate from command module, and a propulsion and equipment module. So they were kind of showing like what was the plan, how they were kind of thinking about it, all that stuff, which is great. That's kind of part in the real world, the proposal work, right? You're kind of proposing a solution or proposing a potential solving of a problem or an improvement, right? So then in August of 1960, feasibility study competition was announced. So they first had to understand whether there was feasibility or not, which is all part of, again, the business value. Kind of the same thing with the Manhattan Project, right? Where we had to do a series of feasibility studies to see what would be possible, what would be the best chemical compound to create the nuclear bomb. Same thing here with, Apollo program. We had to kind of see if like what we were kind of proposing in terms of the preliminary specs would be possible and achievable, right? So, in October 25th of 1960, 3 study contracts were awarded to General Dynamics and Convair, which I guess General Dynamics would be the prime and then the Convair would be the sub, or it could have been vice versa, whatever. They didn't really specify that. General Electric, and the Glenn L. Martin Company. Meanwhile, while those 3 companies were doing, 3 different study contracts, NASA performed its own in-house spacecraft design studies led by Maximin Faget. I don't want to say it differently. I'm going to say it like it's French and just go with it. To serve as a gauge to judge and monitor the 3 studies. And this was very important because, again, we were just talking about business value. And in business value, you have to do a lot of research to understand, is this worthwhile or not? And this was all part of that effort for the Apollo program, was to say, is this worth it or not? Can this be done? Are we able to do it? And sometimes, too, we have to think of the fact that certain technologies were not available at that time, right? So we had to really think about what they had to work with. And at the end of the day, they did do a lot of achievements in that regard. And it was very fascinating to kind of read about. Now, of course, when we kind of get to the end, I am going to warn you that I don't have a lot of references because as I was researching a lot of the other sites that I found, they kind of were repeating the same information. So the Wikipedia site that talked about the Apollo program and broke it down was the best resource when it came to this. The Britannica was kind of a second best, but the Wikipedia was a fantastic one. Now, before we move on to the development and expansion, does anyone have any questions? I'm just going to check Twitter space as well. No? Okay. So we are moving on to the implementation of the Apollo space program, which it's going to include a mixture of things. It's going to include the development and expansion. It's going to include some politics. That's for sure. There were a lot of politics, not going to lie. It was very interesting, too, to read about. So let's begin. So, of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower had the idea, and he was kind of like, we need to do this. But along came John F. Kennedy. November 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president after campaigning that promised Americans superiority over the Soviet Union in space exploration and missile defense. So he was a huge proponent of this in his campaign, of course. I mean, kind of a typical politician, right? They kind of say what they're thinking and planning to do, but then you kind of see they don't do it. It's kind of interesting. Anyhow, this is not a politics program here. So this included in his campaign that Kennedy spoke out about the missile gap due to inaction of Eisenhower. And so because of that, he was elected. But of course, despite his rhetoric, he did not immediately come to a decision on the status of the Apollo program once he became president, which it just kind of baffles me with Kennedy, because when we think of the moon landing, we're always thinking of Kennedy, and we're like, yeah, Kennedy, he was behind that, he was all about it, blah 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 blah. But when you really like get into the meat and grind of the information, you realize, wow, this guy really could not make a decision. And so a number of things had to happen to kind of push him to finally make a decision to support or not. And in fact, later on, some of his constituents and even some other congressmen were like, dude, get on the bandwagon here. Let's do this. Let's get to space. Let's land on the moon. So, of course, in April 12th, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, sorry if I butcher his name, became the first person to fly into space, reinforcing Americans' fears about being left behind in a technological competition with the Soviet Union. So then on April 20th, Kennedy sent a memo to Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson asking Johnson to look into the status of America's space program and into programs that could offer NASA the opportunity to catch up. Johnson responded approximately 1 week later, concluding that we neither making maximum effort nor achieving results necessary if this country is to reach a position of leadership. His memo concluded that a crewed moon landing was far enough in the future that it was likely the United States would achieve it first. So, which that's kind of what happened anyways, because in the previous program, which was Mercury, you had a pod that was only sending one astronaut anyway. So we were kind of already ahead. We just needed to figure out how to get 3 people up there. Instead of one, we got to get 3. So the first one was the Manned Spacecraft Center, where Robert Guruth was given authorization to expand NASA. So once, of course, that all happened, NASA just got really big. Like, they started really expanding on all their departments and what they can do and where they can get what and where they can be located, all that fun jazz. All because finally, it was kind of a push moment from the Soviet Union of them getting into space. So, of course, this was first the MSC, the Manned Spacecraft Center. The site was chosen in Houston, Texas, on land donated by Rice University, and Administrator Webb announced the conversion on September 19th, 1961. And then, of course, that center, the MSC, or the Manned Spacecraft Center, was completed in September of 1963. It was renamed by the U.S. Congress in honor of Lyndon Johnson soon after his death in 1973. So, I mean, which is not a big deal. Things, change names due to whatever. So then we had another one. We had a Launch Operations Center, or the LOC, or LOC, or however you want to pronounce it. So the LOC included Launch Complex 39, a launch control center, and a 130 million cubic foot vertical assembly building in which the space vehicle, launch vehicle, and spacecraft, of course, would be assembled on a mobile launcher platform and then moved by a crawler transporter to one of several launch pads. Although at least 3 pads were planned, only 2, designated A and B, were completed in October 1965. The lock also included an operations and checkout building to which Gemini and Apollo spacecraft were initially received prior to being mated to their launch vehicles. The Apollo spacecraft would be tested in 2 vacuum chambers capable of simulating atmospheric pressures at altitudes of 250,000 feet, which is nearly a vacuum. So they were doing a lot of launch pad builds, because again, where are you going to launch these things? I mean, this is no longer some tiny little craft with one astronaut. You're talking 3. So you got to figure out how to make that happen, right? So that's another one. Then, of course, we had to pick on the mission mode. So now, again, going back to business value. Why are we doing this? What is our mission? We're a program, not a project. Therefore, what are we doing? What is our mission? So, once Kennedy had defined a goal, the Apollo mission planners were faced with a challenge of designing a spacecraft that could meet it while minimizing risk to human life, cost, and demands on technology and astronaut skill. 4 possible mission modes were considered. So 4. You had direct ascent. That's the spacecraft would be launched as a unit and travel directly to the lunar surface without first going into lunar orbit. A 50,000-pound Earth return ship would land all 3 astronauts atop a 113,000-pound descent propulsion stage, which would be left on the moon. The design would have required development of the extremely powerful Saturn C-8 or Nova launch vehicle to carry a 163,000-pound payload to the moon. So that's 1. You then had Earth Orbit Rendezvous, or EORs. Multiple rocket launches, up to 15 in some plans, would carry parts of the direct ascent spacecraft propulsion units for translunar injection. These would be assembled into a single spacecraft in Earth orbit. So you had that. Then you had lunar surface rendezvous. 2 spacecrafts would be launched in succession. The first, an automated vehicle carrying propellant for the return to Earth, would land on the moon to be followed sometime later by the crew vehicle. Propellant would have to be transferred from the automated vehicle to the crewed vehicle. So it's kind of like they kind of thought ahead, like, okay, we'll get a gas station up there, and then once we have the gas station there, then they can gas up and come back, kind of deal, because, you gotta take some fuel to get through this, right? So kind of need it. Then the 4th was lunar orbit rendezvous. This turned out to be the winning configuration, which achieved the goal with Apollo 11 on July 24th of 1969, a single Saturn V launch at a 96,886-pound spacecraft that was composed of a 63,608-pound Apollo Command and Service Module, which remained in orbit around the moon, and a 33,278-pound two-stage Apollo Lunar Module spacecraft, which was flown by 2 astronauts to the surface, flown back to dock with the command module, and was then discharged, or not discharged, discarded, landing the smaller spacecraft on the moon and returning an even smaller part to lunar orbit, minimize the total mass to be launched from Earth. But this was the last method initially considered because of the perceived risk of rendezvous and docking, which, again, we've seen some of these space movies where we have to kind of think about, well, how much fuel are we using? Because, again, there's kind of no space gas stations hanging out there. I know that's kind of been my joke right now is, having space gas stations chilling, waiting for our various, spaceships to come through and do their thing, right? But, that again, these are our different missions because, again, we're fulfilling a business value. Now, before I continue on, does anyone have any questions? No? Alrighty then. So we're going to continue on with the spacecraft itself. So, the guy's name that I'm not going to pronounce because I don't want to. His preliminary Apollo design employed a cone-shaped command module that's supported by one of several service modules providing propulsion and electrical power, sized appropriately for the space station, cislunar, and lunar landing missions. So he kind of designed the spacecraft, and they talked about all these designs they did and all these different types of crafts. They had the Saturn, they had the Apollo, they had this type and that thing, and oh my gosh, it was so much information, and they were all very technical, which I'm not trying to have a technical conversation to some degree because, again, as PMs, it's great to understand technicalities, but at the same time, you're not really the smart one in the room. It's your engineers who are the smart ones in the room. No offense. So, but all these things they did and all these different spacecrafts they had, it was very fascinating. Now, of course, we know of 2 famous Apollo missions. We know So, as previously mentioned, Apollo 11, which we're going to briefly talk about, this is the one where it's famous for the astronaut Neil Armstrong. This guy was the one that landed on the moon first. It was that famous phrase of what's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That's a huge step forward because they had a previous Apollo missions in the past, but this one was the very first for humans, for mankind to step foot on the moon. So Apollo 11 was the first one. Then the other one that's famous, that's a movie, and it's got Tom Hanks in it and a couple other famous actors, is called Apollo 13. That's the one that, though, I mean, people consider it not successful because they didn't land on the moon, but you're talking some real engineering creativity that went into saving them. We have to admit that's a huge thing to be able to adjust and be able to figure it out on Earth to then help the astronauts. I mean, you can't get engineering like that to that degree unfortunately, in my mind, just based on my experience, you know. Others may have a difference of opinion, but that kind of creativity, my gosh, it's a huge thing. So, we might talk about them later, but just keep that in mind. But of course, the last thing we're going to really talk about when it comes to the Apollo program, because again, there was just so much stuff. The next thing we're going to talk about is the cost of the Apollo program. Now, again, we think like $100 million projects are, a big deal. Imagine a program. So you're talking multiple different projects, all kinds of resource constraints and coordination and materials and procurement and risk management and quality management. I mean, think about all of that you got to consider. So, Apollo cost 25.4 billion, or approximately 164 billion in 2021 dollars when adjusted for inflation. Of this amount, 20.2 billion, or 131 billion adjusted, was spent on the design, development, and production of the Saturn family of launch vehicles, the Apollo spacecraft, spacesuits, scientific experiments, and mission operations. The cost of constructing and operating Apollo-related ground facilities such as the NASA Human Spaceflight Center and the Global Tracking and Data Acquisition Network added an additional 5.2 billion, or of course 33.7 billion adjusted. The amount grows to 28 billion, or 181 billion adjusted, if the costs for related projects such as Project Gemini, the Robotic Ranger, Surveyor, and Lunar Orbiter programs are included. So, and as I said, the Wikipedia site that talked about the Apollo space program was a perfect just hub of information. So they provided a cost breakdown as reported to Congress in the spring of 1973 as follows. Now, if you follow me on Patreon, you get access to my script. So you'll get to see this particular chart broken down for you, and of course you'll get access to the links, you'll get access to my sources, etc., etc. So the Apollo breakdown. So Apollo spacecraft with original dollars was 8.5 billion. Saturn launch vehicles was 9.1 billion. Launch vehicle engine development 0.9 billion. Operations 1.7 billion. So then that's total in R&D, which R&D stands for research and development, was 20.2 billion. In addition to R&D, you then had tracking and data acquisition, which was 0.9 billion. Ground facilities 1.8 billion, and operations of installations 2.5 billion, all totaling 25.4 billion. In 1973. That's insane. I mean, they were successful, so I can let them pass on spending so much money, unlike the FBI virtual case files, where they just spent millions and barely got anywhere. But of course, without ending this wonderful stream, which I know is really short, but it's a program. I mean, I'm not going to get into all the projects because we need to actually go deeper into the projects and understand how the projects worked so that it makes sense as to why the program was so massive. So, of course, to end it, we have the legacy of the Apollo program. And there's just a couple things that we wanted to note. And that the Apollo program has been described as the greatest technological achievement in human history. Apollo stimulated many areas of technology, leading to over 1,800 spin off products as of 2015, including advances in the development of cordless power tools, fireproof material, heart monitors, solar panels, digital imaging, and the use of liquid methane as fuel. Now, there was a brief mentioning of environmental impacts, but here's the thing. When you're on Earth, you can't really see what it really looks like from space until you go out there. And so I think it was one of the other missions that where they were able to take pictures for the first time to see the Earth so that we could actually see how the atmosphere looks kind of from the outside. So instead of being on the inside trying to look up, we're being on the outside looking down. So that kind of helped in seeing how the Earth was composed, which that's led to all the satellite stuff, right? So that's why with satellite imaging now we can see rivers drying up, streams drying up, where are desert areas versus where are forest areas, all that fun jazz. But that all came about because of the Apollo space program. And, I know hearing like all the costs and everything, you kind of sit there and you're like, oh my God, that's a lot. Why would you spend that much money? Well, it's important. Certain things are very vital and important. It's like the research into the DNA, right? Without that research into DNA, we wouldn't have forensic science today. If we did not research that, we'd still be figuring out how how we're so unique to each other. Without DNA, we wouldn't have been able to do fingerprinting, for example, or learn how really interesting tidbit, though not related to the Apollo program, how twins tend to have the same DNA, so you kind of have to go off a parent, for example, when you're doing forensic science. I know it's just kind of nerded there, but you get the point. But overall, programs do provide business value and they do provide value overall. But again, that's why we as program project managers need to understand what is it we're doing? What are we getting out of this? And how is it going to impact society? I mean, you just heard Apollo had a huge impact. I mean, I still know individuals that remember the lunar space landing of Apollo 11. There's still people that remember that to this day. I know there's some conspiracy theories around that, and I'm not going to get into that. But overall, it's really interesting and fascinating. And so, with that said, we're going to continue this journey with the Apollo program. Since now we've identified it, we now can go look at the individual Apollo missions. So, if you're interested, stay tuned because we'll be talking more about space very soon. And thank you all for joining. Those of you that have joined, I will pause if anyone has any final thoughts or questions for me. All right. I know this was a very short live stream, but I think it's worthwhile to introduce so that we'll get into the other missions so now you can see how they all come together, and that's how programs work. Thank you for joining, and I will see you at the next stream. Thanks, PM Peeps.